Hi, everybody. My name is Natalie Yeadon, and I'm one of the co-owners and managing directors with Impetus Digital. Impetus Digital has built some of the best-in-class asynchronous and synchronous virtual collaboration tools. We work with life science companies, things like pharmaceutical, biotech, medical device companies, to help them virtualize their in-person meetings. Everything from advisory boards, working groups, medical education, and since COVID-19, also things like brand plan rollouts and sales and MSL training. But more importantly than that, at Impetus, we really believe that everything starts with a question. And then from a question comes a conversation. And we really like to indulge in some of these kinds of big, hairy, audacious conversations, like the ones we're having with the Justins of the world, the provocateurs, the people who are in what we call some of the leading edge spaces, so that we can all collectively work to help positively disrupt healthcare. And so I'm really, really pleased to be able to have and to be able to host one of these conversations. And super excited that we have Justin Sutherland with us today. Now, for those of you who don't know who Justin has actually got a PhD in health and medical physics from the Carleton University here in Canada, close to Ottawa. He is a clinical medical physicist at the Ottawa Hospital, and he's also the assistant professor in the Department of Radiology at the University of Ottawa Faculty of Medicine. So apart from his clinical role, he's also interested in the research and development of clinician as user virtual reality medical applications. So we're going to get into all kinds of exciting things. We talk about really what his company at Realize Medical is doing. So he actually co-founded this company, Realize Medical Incorporated. It's a medical VR startup, and what they're really trying to do is offer medical imaging, viewing, modeling, and communication, and a communication platform that combines novel 3D visualization with the familiar and intuitive input of a handheld stylus. So what Realize Medical is trying to change is how medical images are viewed and how we interact with them, so that really everybody can benefit, both healthcare professionals as well as patients. So welcome, Justin. Great to have you on the show.
Thanks a lot.
That's awesome. We were talking a little bit earlier about your background. I was wondering, since it is such an exciting, new, novel area that you are endeavoring with Realize Medical, tell us a little bit about your trajectory and really what kind of brought you to this space in the first place.
Sure. So I've been a VR enthusiast since I was a little kid. When they had the early VR systems in the 90s at amusement parks and things like that, my brother and I always used to imagine the future of what would happen when this technology came about. And it took a while, but eventually it started to resurge, I think 2016 with the Oculus Quest, or Oculus Rift rather. So my interest in it was largely from a video game perspective. I was interested in just having one of these systems and then using it. And one of the first demos in the system that you could get early on, it had a medical application, and I found it super interesting. And obviously there's so many things that you could do with this technology. So I pitched it to my boss in the medical physics department at the Ottawa Hospital to see if we could start doing research, to see if we could figure out different ways that we could use this technology. So he agreed to that, and we just kind of got started within the department with a headset and a computer. And we kind of took things from a general question of how would Superman do X-ray vision? So if you think about it in a movie, Superman looks at Lois Lane and he just peers into her body and he sees what he's looking for, right? And because you can create whatever you want in a virtual environment, like we have the capability now to make that a reality. But the question we had was, what does that actually look like? Like Superman can just naturally see behind the spleen to what he wants to, like all the organs are just there for him to see. Whereas what we have is medical images that are taken from a CT scanner or an MRI. And those show different aspects of the body in different black and white values. And we can turn those into 3D images, but how do we make that into like an actual platform that people can use to interact with?
So really interesting, Justin. So like maybe what we can actually sort of state here is a little bit of the problem statement, if you will, which is really the platform at which you built Realize Medical. So what you're suggesting is that our current model involves the scans from CT scans, and then, you know, the next evolution of that, which is MRIs.
Mm-hmm.
So can you kind of explain a little bit about what those are and what the current limitations are, which you have leveraged as a springboard to what you're doing around the 3D modeling of that?
Sure. So there actually are people in the hospital who you could say have X-ray vision, and those would be radiologists. So those are doctors who go through a great deal of training to look at the images that are acquired by scanners and to see what's in them. And generally what they do is they share their findings in a report where they will describe what they've seen. And so the next healthcare provider, like a surgeon or a general practitioner, will read that. And then they're basically sharing their X-ray vision with the person down the line. So that's obviously a very low bandwidth form of communication, just a text report. And so there's been a growing demand for 3D visualization of medical content. And so often this can take the form of 3D printing in some of the novel cases. So that's been growing over the last 10 years, the amount of 3D printing that's going on. And so in that case, what a physician like a radiologist will do is they'll go through the image and they'll make a 3D model out of it, like one that you could put in a video game, for example. And then they might 3D print that and they'll hand it to the next person down the line, like a surgeon. And so what they're doing is they're not just sharing what they saw, but now they're sharing what they see. And so they're kind of taking that knowledge that they have about understanding the image, the black and white abstract art visualizations that you might see on a CT scan, and they're turning it into something that's easily digestible in a 3D manner. So from our company's perspective, we said that this whole content creation process is done still in a 2D domain, where all of the benefit is downstream to the people that are consuming the content. But creating 3D content makes more sense to do in a true 3D environment. And so the actual product that we created, Elucis, was largely around facilitating the creation of that content. So have it there in 3D as you're making it. And the best way to put it is two ways. Imagine you were a car mechanic and you could only look at an engine one thin slice at a time from one orientation. And then you had to diagnose what was wrong with the car. That's the way that we look at medical images today, is we scroll through slices and it basically goes down the body in one orientation. And then if you're making 3D content out of that, you might have a side view that shows the work that you're doing, but it's still abstracted. And then another aspect of it is, imagine you had a master sculptor who maybe was doing clay modeling, and you told them that you had a new product that was going to make their job a ton easier. And you say, okay, put the clay away, step away from the table. Now you're going to sit in front of a computer screen with a mouse, and you're going to do your work that way. So that illustrates how creating that 3D content just doesn't make sense when you have these 2D inputs like a computer mouse. And so what we did with our platform is all the content is there in front of you. You have access to these 2D slices that you're used to seeing, but in a flexible manner where you can kind of rotate the whole image. And then as you're creating the 3D model, it's there in front of you. And then you can do a lot of those like clay modeling tools or inputs that you would normally have, where you need to erase something, you just wave your hand over it and actually like physically erase it. And so by doing that, we've made it a lot more intuitive. And then the next step is to how to facilitate that content creation, or sorry, the communication. So the radiologist who shares his X-ray vision with the next person. And so you can imagine that a shared virtual environment where you're remotely connected would be super powerful for that. And so that's something that we'll be releasing within a month, I think.
Wow, very exciting. You mentioned the brain behind your platform, and you called it Elucis. Can you tell the audience here why you named it Elucis, and also like what kind of algorithmic kind of brain power have you put behind this? You know, what is sort of the special, I mean, obviously without getting anything proprietary, but what is sort of unique, if you will, about this versus other things that might be in the marketplace right now?
Right. So Elucis, it's one word as the title of our platform, but the two words Elucis in Latin mean from light. And so that's an allusion to the fact that all of these things are generated often from X-rays shooting through patients, which is just a high energy form of light. And then when you're interacting with this entirely virtual environment, creating real content in front of you, that's just light fed to you from the headset into your eyes. And so it's this idea of that is behind the name. So what makes our platform different? We took things from a very careful perspective where we wanted to give physicians real precision input into the system. So you can imagine that you're creating art in 3D, and there's all sorts of applications, or there's a number of good applications. One actually from Ottawa called Masterpiece VR, where you make 3D models by like waving your hands in the air. But if you're trying to high fidelity reproduce what's in an image, then you want a really high precision input. And so what we did is we based our whole platform around the idea of having a hard surface. So imagine that you have a Wacom tablet, like a computer screen that you can write on, except now the Wacom tablet is simply just a desk surface in real life, and you put the VR headset on, and then in the virtual environment, it's a very elaborate 2D, 3D tablet space. And so that's basically the premise of our system. With that, you can use a VR stylus or a controller that simply has one overlaid in virtual reality, but it's better with an actual stylus. And then you can write on that surface, like drawing on the image, erasing parts of the model, like defining regions where you want an algorithm to work. Then you can just pull it off the surface and start working in the air. And so it's that interaction which makes us very unique, I'd say.
Yeah, it sounds really interesting. And obviously we're going to be sharing a link to your website where a lot of this is being shared. You captured this really nicely in some of your videos, because it is difficult in a fireside chat with something that is so visual to be able to explain it. But I think you did a really great job there. So you and I share in some ways some of this physics. You know, I was a radiation therapist at one point. You're obviously a medical physicist. And let's be really frank. I mean, having been in the radiation therapy area where there's a radiologist reading, this is very important, obviously, for cancer patients, amidst all patients, who are going for CTs, MRIs for a myriad of different conditions, is, we're used to some of the old school ways that we've always been doing things. So if we actually isolate and dissect the physician journey of the workflow, they're showing up in this dark room, they're kind of checking charts and doing things in a very 2D analog way with a computer, and just, there's a whole series of things set up and a methodology and a workflow that has become very ingrained as part of the standard of practice. If one was to institute Elucis and really what you are bringing to the table with, medical, Realize Medical, how are you going to intervene on some of the old school thinking and getting some of these people who are not very tech savvy to not only use something completely new, but then drawing and being a creative, manifester, if you will, of something that they've never created before. They're more just reacting to things as opposed to creating. So tell us a little bit about the thinking and the methodology of how you're going to intervene with that.
Right. So first of all, by no means are we replacing the radiologist report, right? So the demand for 3D content in medicine is growing all the time, but it's not replacing all things that people like radiologists do. So largely the people that would be interested in our platform are those people that are currently doing things like 3D printing. So every day we find out that there's a new institution in the States or in Canada that's starting like an advanced visualization or 3D printing program. These are largely staffed by radiologists or their trainees. And these are people that are already going through the painstaking process of creating this content to either print or use in virtual or augmented reality. So for them, the value proposition is very simple. We give them a platform that lets them do their work more intuitively and quickly. Part of our goal as a company is to make the actual act of creating this content so easy that it just becomes more widely applicable. So a great example of that is 3D printing is used quite a bit in cardiac cases where there's a particular difficult to visualize 3D problem. But for some of the surgeries that aren't as difficult from a 3D perspective, it's not used often. That said, there's a lot of value to be gained in interacting with patients and then showing them something that makes sense. So we've put videos online and we've had people comment that like, oh, I wish I had this when my dad was getting his surgery because they showed us these images and I couldn't understand it. My mom just had a hip implant and I quickly made a model of a pelvis and then showed her like, okay, this is the femur that goes into it. So she had the headset on and I was pointing stuff out to her. And that kind of interaction doesn't happen these days because creating that content is too difficult and it takes too much time. So we want to make that easier. And then in that sense, then it would drive people to adopt the technology. Another
I think it's really cool that you're going for the early adopters now, people who are already dealing with 3D printing, which is really brilliant.
Yeah, so another point which is closer to our shared home of radiation oncology, so the treatment of cancer with radiation. One of the tasks of a radiation oncologist in planning the treatment is to define the volume that encompasses the tumor. And sometimes these things can be very difficult to visualize on the conventional orientations that we're used to seeing, right? The body doesn't work in right angles, and it's difficult to visualize an image when it's not on one of these planes that we're trained on, right? There's a lot of work that goes into saying, okay, this is a vessel, this is like a tumor, these are lymph nodes. And one of the benefits that our platform can bring is because we have this flexible visualization where you can actually rotate the image with your hands, you understand that transformation that's happened to the 2D visualization. And you can also input your work there. So rather than having to contour every slice on an axial orientation, you can then move it and then see it from a way that's understandable. And that's something that the radiation oncologists that we've worked closely with as this product's been developed at the Ottawa Hospital have been super excited about. So my first assumption was that there was going to be some pushback against this technology because you're asking people to get in a headset and then kind of do things differently. But I was actually very surprised by the enthusiasm of my physician colleagues, where they started immediately thinking of different things that they could do with it. So that was very encouraging.
Wow, very, very cool. I love it. So as we think about you're targeting initially what we call the early adopters. I mean, it's always a bell curve of adoption. And then when their colleagues see the success and as you evolve the product, so that it becomes easier and easier, gets presented at conferences and people understand this is kind of the new mainstay way of doing things, you'll start hitting the middle of the bell curve and, move it along the trajectory. Part of this also comes down to the question of accessibility. So there's a cost associated with using this. And ultimately the cost is not, this is a very different kind of thing when we're talking about diagnostics. This is not something that's being basically sold to the end user, which is the patient or the consumer. So then, where there lies the question of who pays for this. Is this at an institutional level? Is this, something that's going to be paid for by public payers? Tell us a little bit about some of the thinking that's going on around the accessibility of software like this.
Right. So currently, these type of activities, it's growing around 30% every year, and it's not reimbursed from a billing perspective. So the Radiological Society of North America has a 3D printing special interest group, and they've done a lot of work in terms of instituting billing codes in the States that are mostly for information gathering purposes right now, but it will lead to the ability to bill insurance for the creation of a 3D printed model. But all the activities that are going on to date are happening now without that reimbursement in place. So for us, if we can provide a cost saving measure in terms of the amount of time and potentially in terms of sharing the results of your work, where you don't have to wait for a printer to go for 12 hours, you can just get in a headset with your colleague and explain things to him, then that's an easy way for an institution to save money while still spending on it. And then I think a lot of it is driven by innovative departments within organizations. So they'll be spending money just adopting new technology in general, and then we can fit into that.
Yeah, I love it. And these are all brand new technologies. This is new thinking. This is why you're hearing, the premiers of all the provinces, balloting for increase, for increases for reimbursement and for funding for healthcare, because these kinds of innovations are just starting. And healthcare is just truly being disrupted right now with all of these innovations. So as we just sort of linger on this concept for a few moments, ultimately payments come from interested stakeholders. And usually this is a transference of one cost to the other, with ideally, at the end of the day, there ends up being a burgeoning of costs overall. but with ideally the transference of a cost to another cost, or a decrease in perceived cost. And so one of the ways, I guess, of achieving this is being able to determine things like impact on patient outcomes, or speed and accuracy on the side of the diagnostician or the radiologist. Are you endeavoring on any sort of clinical trials in this areas to be able to develop some of these metrics, to be able to eventually display and deliver to some of these reimbursing agencies?
Yeah, so we're undertaking a few studies to show the improvement in efficiency in the use of the platform. We aren't taking part in any clinical trials that are talking about endpoints, but there's a great deal of research being done on many fronts doing this with 3D printed content. So insofar as we enable people to do that work, then we benefit that endpoint. And there's a lot of promising results so far that shows that having some sort of 3D visualization in an immersive environment, or having a 3D printed object in front of you, can really improve the outcomes of the surgery, make it happen faster, and then make it less likely that you'll have to go back in to fix something. And it's to the point where a very renowned physician colleague has said that when it comes to pediatric cardiology, it's almost immoral or unethical to not do a 3D printed model ahead of time.
Yeah, so what I'm hearing you say, Justin, is that the next frontier in terms of, the radiologist or the, whoever is doing the diagnosis, is the next layer is the 3D printed model. And I think what you're really saying is that you're showing kind of afterwards is you're kind of after that. So if there is clinical studies and being able to show impact on outcomes and other sorts of associated metrics that way, you would potentially then be able to do studies to compare yourself to 3D models. Is that kind of what maybe might be part of your longer term plan?
Yeah, so we basically are in the business of helping people create 3D models and then communicate and use them. So one of the things the platform can do is, once you've made a model quickly out of a medical image, you can just export it in seconds and then send that to a printer. So we're not trying to make sure that everyone stays in a narrow lane in terms of using our platform. We're mostly about giving these tools to physicians. So there's no uploading images to our website so that we do the work for you. We give you the tool that makes you do it easily. And then what you want to do with that is your choice. So for example, we have a number of tools that would make communication in our platform very valuable. But if you want to put it in HoloLens and you have a specific application that you use for that, you just export the model and use it yourself. So because we're at the very beginning of the workflow, then all the downstream benefits that happen from generating that content is something that we promote.
What do you have to say around the never-ending conundrum of interoperability? And the fact that so many different institutions, let alone provinces, have completely different and disparate systems for their electronic health records. And your main objective is to make this as simple and seamless as possible. What are some of the challenges that you've run into in some of the fixes, if you will, to make this really easy for the end user?
Yeah, so in the domain of medical imaging, we're at a bit of an advantage because there's a very well adopted international standard called DICOM, so Digital Images and Communication in Medicine. And that standard defines the transfer and storage of medical images. So our system, since we support the DICOM standard, we can import images from pretty much any software or any hardware because everyone else does it as well. The nice thing is that the standard is always growing, and they've implemented ways to have the models that would be normally exported in an STL or OBJ file. So those are the typical models that you might use for VR simulation or 3D printing. And those are now part of the DICOM standard. So you can basically ensure the interoperability by maintaining your adherence to that.
Fantastic. That's really good to know.
Yeah.
And it's nice to see that there's, somewhat of a seamlessness, because so many other people are challenged in that particular area. So let's talk a little bit about some of the hardware that's required. At the end of the day, I think you actually alluded to this earlier, is that VR came in much earlier. It was almost, in some ways, people touted it almost like a Blu-ray, where it was almost ahead of its time. The technology was here and then it was gone. And then really, like you said, quite recently, starting in as soon as 2014, 2015, it's had a bit of a resurgence,
Mm-hmm.
and certainly has taken off since COVID-19. So, one of the concerns, of course, has to do with some of the stuff that you get saddled down with. So regardless of how high tech these headsets are, they're still cumbersome. There's something that there are things that prevent us from interacting with our day-to-day world, where you almost have to tap out for a little bit. Can you speak a little bit to some of the concerns, some of the things that you've had to say to allay some of the concerns, and more importantly, what you see as being the future of some of this hardware?
Right. So I think there's a number of things there. One of them is that there's some positives and benefits to virtual reality headset. So like you alluded to, sometimes it can be uncomfortable, although that's changing every day, or not every day, but every year there's new headsets that are coming out that are improving on that. And then it cuts you off from the real world. And in some cases that can be a hindrance, but in many ways that's actually a benefit. So you talked about radiologists being in dark rooms in hospitals to look at images. And that's for a very good reason, that we want to ensure the brightness and contrast of what they're seeing. And if you have a very bright light shining on a screen and there's glare, or your eyes are accustomed to bright light and you're looking at a dark image, you don't see what you're trying to see. By virtue of cutting you off from the real world, you can remove the need for an entire room dedicated to reading images that has special lighting and special computer screens, because you basically bring that with you, right? And so there's no concern of glare from some ambient source of image in a virtual environment, because you can just display the underlying pixel values of the image directly to the person's eyes. That said, there are some considerations for the quality of the image that's displayed in a VR headset. And we're looking into different ways to characterize that to ensure that people are seeing the image at a high enough resolution and all those types of things. And then another aspect of being cut off from the real world is that it can be an encumbrance to communication, right? So you imagine an augmented reality headset where it's a clear visor that has holograms of a sort that are displayed onto your eyes by reflecting them. In that case, you can interact with other parts of the real world or other people that are there, and you can have a shared communication. Well, in a virtual environment, you can't do that, but what you can do is have remote communication with someone that's very far away. And again, because you have access to this entire new world that you've generated, that means that you can make use of all that space and do all these interesting things with it. So one of the things I like to think about with this is the old saying, the medium is the message. And so in this case, when you're talking about these remote VR communications where you're generating entire worlds that you imagine, then that really is the case.
It really is. That's very cool. I'm also thinking a little bit about the user of this. So the radiologist, sort of either new graduates, or comparing all the way to some people who've been working for the last 30 or 40 years. There's obviously a question around tech savviness.
Yeah.
And this is something, even at Impetus Digital, just even being even using like a 2D platform with just basic, interesting asynchronous and synchronous tools. There's always this question. So tell us a little bit about some of the reticence and maybe some of the objections, if you will, of maybe more of that muddy middle, or when you're eventually going to become mainstream. The challenges that you sort of see because of the concerns of, I like what I'm doing already, or this, I'm not tech savvy, or I can't even turn on my computer. What do you say to those individuals?
Yeah, so there's definitely a wide range in tech savviness and the ability to adopt the technology. I've seen people that they put it on and they're already using it faster than I can explain it to them. And then there are some people that they do this thing that I call the claw, where you're instructing them to press a button on the controller and they seem to be unable to just press one button without clenching their entire hand. And it's like they can't move anymore, or like reach out and touch something and they've forgotten the ability to extend their arm. But it's just a communication thing and a being familiar with it. the majority of people tend to take things up very quickly because it's intuitive, because it's a 3D environment. In terms of getting people to adopt the technology, part of our task is to basically make it valuable enough that whatever things that people don't like about working with a headset on, like maybe the discomfort of it or being cut off from the real world, that's something that's overcome by the benefit. And to a large extent, we've done that. Although there are some people that are hesitant to putting away a screen and wanting to be cut off from the things that they're normally used to working with around them. In terms of getting people to take it on, I think that one of the challenges that we've dealt with, especially in the COVID environment, is that seeing is believing when it comes to this technology. So have you tried VR before?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so it's not the same. Like you see it on a computer screen, and you're like, that looks cool. And then you put it on and it's completely not what you expected. It's like, wow. And so there's a benefit to that in terms of promoting our platform. You can see videos of me or someone else like drawing and then having the images and 3D models just come to life as you wave your hands, but it's totally different when you're doing the work. And so getting people in headsets to try it goes a long way towards getting them on board with the technology. So we were actually going to go to a reasonably small conference in February, and 2 days ahead of time, it got canceled because of COVID. Mm-hmm. So kind of had to pivot and figure out ways to get this in people's hands in a way that was done remotely. And so that's been a challenge, but I think we've done a pretty good job of it.
That's phenomenal. Absolutely. The trial piece, especially with new technologies like this, is absolutely essential. So I could see how that could really help with adoption rates. I'm actually just curious, still early days for your company, but was just wondering if there's like a demographic or a measurement of specific attributes of individuals that do better with your technology than others. For example, gamers, like people who might have actually had more dexterity or utilization of things in more of a 3D kind of animated, involved and engaged way than others. I'm just curious, has anybody done any studies to determine who might be doing better? And then for those people who might not have those attributes, what sorts of things that you can use to help train them through games or otherwise to get them familiar with how to use these sorts of tools?
Right. So it's pretty easy to see that people that have played video games a fair bit are very fast at picking things up. That's not to say that you're slow if you haven't, but they're almost universally very fast at picking it up. A large part of it is that you're using controllers, right? And you're pushing buttons on them. Not a lot. A lot of stuff is done through hand motions, but in that sense, just the part of your brain that gets trained to like push this button when I want to do this versus looking on a keyboard or navigating through a menu with your mouse, that some people just take that up quicker. But we've done a great deal in terms of designing the user interface to be as intuitive as possible. So when you want to hit a button, you use your VR pen or the controller that has one, and you actually tap the button, right? So it's very intuitive in that sense once you understand how things are laid out. In terms of training people, so one of the things that we've had to do since we can't be in person anymore is we've created a number of interactive tutorials. So basically you start the application, it asks you if you want to do the quick start tutorial the first time, and then it will point things out to you. So it'll have an arrow and say, this is this aspect, and push this button to open up the menu, and then the button highlights. And so we take people through step by step in this interactive environment where they have to complete the next task to get through it. And so that's been a great help in terms of getting people on board. Now that we're imminently going to be introducing the networked capability, that means that we now have the ability to join in a network session with our customers. And it really is as if we have a shared virtual environment. So if I hit a button, then that button gets hit on your end. It's as if we're sitting around a table with a workspace like that clay modeling again, and we're working together. And so that's going to be very powerful for our ability to bring them on and teach them new things. Like, okay, you're used to doing it this way, but now that we're in a 3D environment, you're going to be like drawing and moving like that. So they can see it firsthand as if I'm there sitting beside them. That's going to be very valuable.
I know this is going to sound like a bizarre thing to say, but in some ways, COVID-19 was a bit of a blessing for your company, because I think what it has allowed you to do is to scale a model where you would have traditionally had to do everything in person, but it's sort of forced your hand into creating a scalable model.
Yes, absolutely. It was playing hardball for sure. Like it was a trial by fire, but it forced us to look at things differently. Like we were very focused on doing in-person conferences and trade shows. And then we had to completely change to doing things where we can send them an application and they can use it. And then the remote collaboration capability was always in our vision, but we definitely moved that up the product development pipeline because it makes so much more sense in this environment.
Yeah, I love it. It's just such a case in point of your technology, and just even just the transference of the knowledge is showing cutting edge technology. So it's sort of all in one, which is really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So as we talk about the evolution of the headsets, has there been any another great example of this was Google Glass. And Google Glass was another one of those technologies that one would say was a little ahead of its time, had some things that people didn't like, and sort of kind of went out. Is it coming back? And now we're actually talking about things like Apple Glass. Do you see there being an evolution? And is Realize Medical going to remain agnostic as to the types of hardware that you can use with this, as those kinds of headsets and things that we have to put on are going to change with time?
Yeah, so we are definitely staying agnostic. Right now, we are a virtual reality platform for a few reasons, but we are compatible with any of the headsets that are on the market. And the reason why we're focused on VR is, one, that brightness and contrast thing that I alluded to. So if you have something like the Google Glass or the HoloLens, that can't create blacks, right? All it does is it adds light to what you already see. And because you're working directly from a medical image, there's the importance of being able to see the wide range of brightness values in the image to be able to see what's in there. And we don't think that the augmented reality platform is suitable for doing that kind of work. The downstream work where you have the 3D content you've made and then you're using it, that makes a lot of sense for augmented reality. And we're definitely going to be moving into that space as well. Just from a general perspective, in terms of understanding the technology, we think of it as three different aspects that can tease apart all these different things. So one of them is the visualization, like how much of the real world you see and how much of the virtual world you see. So like HoloLens or the iPad stuff, it's mostly real world with some virtual elements. VR, you're completely cut off and it's all virtual. The other aspect is this notion of perspective generalization. So the Google Glass is a perfect example. It's like a little heads-up display, and if you move your head, then it moves with you, right? There's no sense of it being its own object in space that you can move around, right? And so the VR headsets to date mostly are all very general perspective. So I can have an object, it's there in space, and I can move around it. You can do that with the HoloLens too. Some of the earlier VR headsets, they weren't as generalized because you could only do rotations, right? So you could have a static view of things that kind of made sense, but as soon as you tried to move around it, well, then it broke the illusion. So that's the second aspect. And then the last one is world cognizance. So being knowledgeable about the world around you. And this is when augmented reality really comes into play. So you imagine this use case where a surgeon has an AR headset on and he's using 3D models that they've made previously, maybe in our platform, to help him with the surgery in real time, overlaying this data on the patient. Well, in that sense, the system has to know where the patient is and how to relate the objects in the scene to that position, right? And so that's world cognizance. Or you have your iPad and it shows you a little ball bouncing on a table, right? It has to know where the table is. So all three of those aspects of technology are going to be improving over the coming years. So the visualization quality, the ability to have better tracking, which is the generalization perspective, and then the ability to sense and interact with the real world. And so we're very aware of trying to keep up to date with all those things and make sure that we're making the most use of it.
Interesting. So we've talked a little bit about people like radiologists using this so that they can actually either expedite or improve the error rate, if you will, on certain things that they diagnose, so you get less false positives or negative, or the other way around. So just basically improving the accuracy. We also talked a little bit around using this in oncology, et cetera. So and we also talked about the idea of creating 3D models for the diagnosis of any of these kinds of conditions. So let's actually just think a little bit more at the level of surgeons. So how would a surgeon utilize your software for planning, preparing, and then maybe even executing their surgeries?
Yeah, so the 3D printed models or 3D models used in VR platforms sees a lot of use in surgical planning. So you imagine that you have a tumor and it has blood vessels that are wrapped around it, or it's sitting on the heart or near the lung, and you need to be worried about the different things that are there and come up with your plan of attack of how you're going to go in and do things. And so there's a number of different studies that show that having this 3D visualization ahead of time gives the surgeons a better idea of how they're going to do things, and it makes the surgery happen faster. So I think there was one to do with kidneys recently that showed that there was actually an improvement in speed. It actually can also be used to decide whether they should get one type of surgery or another. So an example of that is with kidney tumors, sometimes they'll do a partial nephrectomy, which is basically just cutting out a portion of it, or they'll do a full one where they take off a whole section of the kidney. So being able to see the problem ahead of time, how much the tumor has invaded things, that can actually change which type of surgery you're going to do, or if you do one at all. And there's a whole bunch of different indications for the application of 3D printed models, which of course applies just the same to VR, for using these things to guide the plan of attack. When it comes to actually printing things, then there's the whole domain of surgical guides and different things that you might print that aren't the organs themselves, right? So obviously you can't use VR to have something that you put in the patient. But if you're designing things and then you make a surgical guide around that, then that's something that's custom made to the patient's anatomy, that when you go in, it's basically like a little thing that you line up and it shows you where to cut, right? Or they're even, because there's all sorts of work going into improving 3D printing with metal material, then it's going to be not too long before many of the implants that are used in orthopedics are going to be completely personalized to patients.
Wow, that was actually going to be my next question about the personalization. So lingering a few more minutes on the highly, I would call the N of one, or the really uber personalized surgery that's going to be really based on your parameters, everything about what's going on with you. The question comes down to is, do you see the day where some of this is going to be roboticized? Meaning you actually will come up with a plan using the 3D model or your particular software. And then the patient shows up for the actual surgery. And a lot of it is already programmed and and there's basically an algorithm that is doing the cutting down to, immense precision. Is that something that people are already looking at?
I imagine that there are. Like, I can't imagine that people wouldn't be pursuing that direction. I don't know of any particular research that's looking into full automation of surgery, but it seems like it's certainly a possibility. I just don't think I have the expertise to be able to say if it's definitely coming or not.
It would be an interesting concept, because as we talk about the virtualization of healthcare and medicine, then you're starting to talk about global opportunity to be working with people across the globe. And it suddenly democratizes healthcare, because people in remote areas can, be in a room and then actually have top-notch surgery. So it's a very interesting potential concept.
Yeah, so I think that it's more likely, or at least earlier on, it's going to be more a notion of these automated algorithms and AIs facilitating people. So one of the things that has come out in a number of research studies when they look at diagnosis with AI is that they'll see, okay, we have this AI model that's going to diagnose lung nodules to see if there's tumors or not. And they do maybe 95% accuracy. And then a physician or a group of physicians will do 94% accuracy. But when you combine the two, then you get to 99%, right? And so it's this union of the automation and the actual input from the person. And that's one of the design philosophies that we have with our platform. So to date, all of the innovation that's gone into creating these models out of images in a 2D platform has been very much of a sort of designing algorithms that kind of work like a wind-up toy. So you have the toy, you wind it up, you let it go, and then it goes along its route, and where it ends up is where it ends up. And if you wanted to do it again, or if you want to change it, you got to start over and set it off in a new direction, right? So that's like this fully automated process. A large amount of what we think a large reason for why that's happened is because we've had bad input into the system, right? So there's no easy way to say here or there. just because you're using a computer screen and a mouse. So in our case, a lot of our algorithms are not fully automated. We have almost none. They're semi-automatic, where you're guiding where the algorithm is working while you're moving your hand, because you're seeing the result live and you're moving it around. So I think that when it comes to the AI implementation into healthcare, it's much more likely to be more powerful and more accessible when you're having like this human computer interface benefit, where you have automation algorithms going, but then they're of the sort that you can interact with them as a live user, right? And the combination of physicians and AI together, I think, will be the real win.
Absolutely. We would be remiss without talking a little bit around privacy and security. There's a lot of talk about, edge technology and things that are just existing within the computers versus going into some sort of random database where things might be aggregated, and population management and having high resolution images to be able to compare and contrast and be able to do all sorts of things. So tell us a little bit about what your company's philosophies are around that whole issue around eventualities of population management and in accelerating health at a higher level versus just keeping things local and secure. And also in the future, do you see these kinds of portals and sharing of images are something that can be leveraged by patient portals who would then be able to also have access to their images as well?
Right. So we're pretty glad to be able to say that we don't handle personal health information at all. So both from a company perspective, it's just easier logistically for us not to deal with that. But then also just as a benefit to our customers or potential customers, that they have the agency to do with their own imaging what they want. So we provide them tools to do the work, and we don't do any telemetry. They don't send us anything and we send anything back. It's always just something that they handle. Even when we have the remote collaboration, the way that works is it's up to them to figure out how to share the data with the other person. So for example, you have images and maybe you have structures that you've made in a project already. You can share that project with whoever you want to collaborate with, but we don't have anything to do with that. So the way that we do it internally in our development is we have a cloud-based server, right? The OneDrive, right? And then we have a shared database on OneDrive. And so we handle that within our own system. You could have a network drive or something like that. Then when you handle the connection, so how do you actually communicate? It's like you have a version of the project on your end, and I have a version of the project on my end. And the way that we can collaborate is that we basically have like a puppet on each side. So if I'm moving my pen and drawing, your side has a pen moving and drawing in the exact same place, right? And it's doing the exact same operations. So whatever changes are made to the anatomy, it's happening independently on both sides, but synchronously so that it's maintained. But at no time is any patient data ever being sent over the network. So there's no images being sent, and there's no structures even. It's just like the order of operations. So if someone were to ever be able to see the data stream that's going by, they would basically say, okay, well, their pen was at this place. And then the only potential source of patient health information leaking would be the transmission of voice. But that you can turn off if you want and then handle it your own way. And then the service that we use to handle the network collaboration, it encrypts the voice traffic. So. And then, so you had a second question, which is how do we see patients interacting with this?
Patient portals, how would they ever have access? Is there, two-way dialogue directly with the patient?
Yeah, so that gets a bit trickier. I think that there's a benefit to having portals and sharing data. Like we're doing so much with AI and things like that, that we would be remiss to not figure out a way to do that also maintains the ideals that we want in terms of privacy and that type of thing. There's just too much value to be gained from the aggregate of all this data to not figure it out. I certainly don't have the answers. In terms of sharing with patients, I think it would be really valuable there are portals now where you can go on and find your images. I just went through that with a family member. And it would be nice to see if we could do something where they could have a VR view into what they're doing. So a way that we could help physicians share with their patients remotely. I think it would be more relevant as the adoption of the technology increases. Like right now we're at the place where it's held back by how many headsets are out there. But as that increases, then certainly that's something that we're interested in.
So that'll be Elucis 2.0.
Yeah.
Which is awesome.
Well,
So,
go ahead.
No, go ahead. Sorry.
I was just going to say my own personal experience. I've shown family members, people, like things that are personally relevant to their own health in terms of also sometimes their own scans. So like someone will have a brain MRI and they'll have it with them. And so like I've made a model of their brain and explained to them the different regions, because luckily I had some anatomical training as a medical physicist, but there's certainly a lot of value to be had in interacting with patients with this type of tool.
I was just curious, we've talked a lot about radiology, we've talked about diagnosing, we've talked about surgery and, everything in between. Where else is your software being considered, employed, utilized? Is, training, medical education, where else is there opportunities for you?
Yeah, so we've actually been surprised by the diverse interest. There's veterinarians have been interested in the platform. There's people that study reptile anatomy and they're using it to teach students with. Right? So there's definitely a big interest in education. I think that one of the things that we're trying to do is just enable the use of 3D content that might get derived from medical images. So almost every hospital that's associated with a medical education institution, they have like a database of images that either they use clinically or they've set aside and anonymized for studies and things like that. Like if we can enable people to create 3D content that then they can teach anatomy with, then that would be great. And I think that there's a lot of interest in that already. Actually, one of our first customers is the Mission Institute in Toronto. So they teach radiation therapists like you would have been. So then one of the interesting things that we found in developing the platform and then using it and testing it is that the act of actually creating the content is educational. So I've had some training in reading images and understanding anatomy as a medical physicist, but it's obviously nowhere near that of a doctor's. And my use of the platform in creating models and testing things is I understand anatomy a lot better. And my own personal experience, I don't know about you, but when I was studying as a student, listening to a lecture, I get some stuff, writing down notes, I get some information. But then when I was actually explaining it to someone or using it, then that's when I really understood it in a deep way. And so we're very interested in looking into people who want to use the platform to teach as doing.
Yeah, it's going to be a phenomenal opportunity. And I think there's been a huge uptake of this since COVID-19. Just in general, when we talk about virtualization of education. So tons of opportunity there. Stepping into the future a little bit and sort of pontificating about where you see the world moving, especially as it relates to surgery and the use of your technologies, in the VR, is the world of mixed reality. Do you see the world one day that physicians may actually be working in virtual reality, where there will be, like, again, AR, VR, and they'll actually be doing surgery in a virtual space? Like, I know we're getting a little bit sci-fi and super abstract, but what is your thoughts there?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, 100%. So whether it's, there already are surgeries that are done with augmented reality. So there's a few products that are out there. It's more on the visualization side of things, but adding content to what you're seeing, and there's some FDA approved ones. So we know that that's happening. I think you were kind of alluding to being cut off from the world in almost like Minority Report or The Matrix, right? And I don't see why not. Like, we have the Da Vinci robot that's like, it does surgery, right? But you're controlling the robot, but then you have some visualization of what it's doing. If we can provide better visuals, like a 3D stereoscopic camera, and then you have a headset, and then you have a sense of depth perception as you're interacting with this, like, why wouldn't we do that? And then if things go towards an automated way where robots are doing more tasks, then you could imagine that a surgeon could be completely remote, right, on the other side of the world. And then actually they do that with the Da Vinci, I think. So yeah, certainly it's just another layer of improved visualization on top of that. So
it really is an exciting frontier. Absolutely. We have a lot of pharmaceutical companies, medical device companies, et cetera, who listen to us and who participate in our ecosystem. If somebody wanted to partner with Realize Medical? What would be some of the ways that they would work with you, and why would they be interested in partnering with your company?
So that's a great question. We've developed a lot of really groundbreaking technology on the software side of things. So medical images are used to look at anatomy of people, but ultimately what it is just a 3D volume of pixels or voxels that has information. And we've done a lot of work in terms of very quickly turning that into 3D models with user input, right? And there's a lot of difficulty in terms of doing that in a fast enough way that it works in virtual reality. And so if people are interested in seeing if there's a use of that technology in some of the other problems, like maybe looking at stacks of cells and things like that, potentially there's a way that we could leverage our technology to make that happen.
Yeah, no, I think that you raised some really good points. I do think there's a lot of life science companies that could leverage your technology for educating their target audiences. Be it, if, for example, diagnostic companies, they might be targeting radiologists, pathologists, things like that. So there could be probably some partnerships there. But even in the pharmaceutical industry, is that there's a lot of work going on right now with biomarkers and diagnostics and being able to find out the perfect target patients. So there may be some incentive and some need for them to be able to accelerate and optimize, if you will, the diagnosis of patients that would be best suited for their particular drug. So I think this was a very interesting, honestly, Justin, you and I could talk for hours. This is such an incredibly exciting space and only beginning to start. And I want to say congratulations again for launching a company right in the middle of COVID-19 and being able to show the world that you can actually create a virtual company. So very
or you can be forced to.
So congratulations to you. And for anybody who is interested, we are going to be leaving some links to Justin, his LinkedIn profile, his company's website. Give him a shout if there's some interest in potentially talking about some partnerships here. So we'll leave that with you. So again, we're really excited about these kinds of conversations. It's one of the reasons why Impetus has actually started this podcast and this YouTube channel, is so that we can have these big, hairy, audacious conversations. So we can talk about things that are going beyond the pill. So some of the bleeding edge technologies. And we have actually built some of these best in class asynchronous and synchronous virtual collaboration tools so we can have these dialogues longitudinally over time and building and building and building on these ideas until they manifest into something that is real. So that's what we really believe at Impetus, and we'd love to hear from you if you're interested in having some of these discussions for your brand or your franchise as well. So thanks to everybody who's attended today. This was an exciting discussion. We want to thank Justin as well and his company for doing some really leading edge things out there. And thank you all, and hoping you all have a great day ahead.